Hey guys, imagine stepping into the candlelit parlors and quiet bedchambers of Victorian England, a world wrapped in lace, duty, and silence. Beneath the satin gowns and grand wedding ceremonies, countless women faced a secret dread, their wedding nights. Tonight we'll uncover why these moments, so often imagined as romantic, were instead filled with fear, ignorance, and pain. We'll explore how strict social codes, the weight of religion, and the iron grip of Victorian law turned the marriage bed into a place of anxiety rather than affection. From the corsets that bound their bodies to the silence that bound their voices, you'll see how women were groomed for purity but denied the knowledge that might have brought them peace. This isn't just a story about intimacy. It's a window into the hidden struggles of an age obsessed with respectability and control. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you truly enjoy exploring the untold stories of history. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this community stretches across the globe. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on the fan for that soft background hum, and let's journey back together into the Victorian night, when the most dreaded moment for many women was not the wedding day, but what followed after. Let's set the scene. When we look into the private world of 19th-century Britain, it is easy to be dazzled by the outward spectacle of the Victorian wedding. A ceremony in a parish church, flowers filling the air with sweetness, satin and lace cascading across pews, a bride crowned in orange blossoms, and solemn vows spoken before God and witnesses. These elements have been preserved in paintings, memoirs, and even the etiquette manuals of the time. But for many women, the beauty of that public pageantry masked a deeply private dread. The dreaded moment was not the exchange of vows, nor the celebration that followed, but the quiet hours when the couple retired to their chamber. The wedding night, which modern imagination often frames as a moment of intimacy and union, was for many Victorian brides an encounter with fear, confusion, and even trauma. Why did so many women hate or dread their wedding nights? To answer this question, we must strip away the romantic imagery and examine the cultural, medical, and legal scaffolding that shaped female experience. What we discover is a society that prized ignorance as purity, celebrated submission as virtue, and created a silence so deep that women entered marriage armed with embroidery skills and piano lessons, but no knowledge of their own bodies. As historians, we must piece together the voices, letters, diaries, advice manuals, medical texts, and even parliamentary debates that reveal the lived reality behind the white satin. At the center of Victorian ideals of womanhood was Coventry Patmore's The Angel in the House, 1854, a long romantic poem that glorified Patmore's first wife as the model of selfless domesticity. In this poem, the wife is not an equal partner, but a figure of moral purity, designed to soothe, to sacrifice, and to inspire. The angel became a cultural archetype repeated endlessly in sermons, in religious tracts, and in women's magazines. For the Victorian bride, this ideal meant that purity was not just a personal trait, but a public performance. To be innocent of sexual knowledge was to prove one's worth as a wife. Mothers, governesses, and aunts would often avoid even the most basic explanations of what married life entailed. Historian Catherine Hughes notes that many middle and upper-class girls were shielded so thoroughly that they walked into marriage with a childlike ignorance of what marriage entailed in practice. Hughes, Victorians Undone. This ignorance was not accidental, but cultivated. The belief was that a woman's charm lay in her innocence. The less she knew, the more angelic she appeared. To know too much, to speak openly about desire, or to show curiosity was to risk being branded immodest or even indecent. Thus, young women were taught to enter marriage as if stepping into a sacred mystery, blindfolded and voiceless. The silence of families was reinforced by medical authorities. In 1857, physician William Acton published his influential The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs. In it, he declared that the majority of women, happily for society, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This single sentence shaped an entire generation's understanding of women's sexuality. By suggesting that women were naturally passionless, Acton turned female ignorance and passivity into medical truth. A bride who felt no desire, who feared intimacy, or who found sex painful, was told she was behaving exactly as nature intended. In contrast, women who admitted to desire risked being labeled unnatural or even pathological. This medical doctrine provided reassurance to men who wished for dutiful, compliant wives, but it trapped women in roles of enforced silence. We see this in diaries of the time. One young wife, Fanny Burney, recorded after her marriage that she felt terrified by her husband's expectations, but reassured herself that women feel not as men feel, and therefore her disinterest was only natural. In reality, many women likely experienced a range of desires and fears, but Acton's words encouraged them to suppress or deny such feelings. One might imagine that mothers would have stepped in to prepare their daughters, yet the Victorian household was complicit in maintaining ignorance. Etiquette manuals for mothers advised them not to disturb the innocence of the young mind. Letters from Victorian brides reveal a consistent pattern. Girls were told to obey, to be patient, to remember their religious duty, and above all, not to ask questions. A striking example comes from the memoirs of Hannah Cullwick, a servant who later married Arthur Munby. Cullwick's diary reveals that even she, exposed to more of the rough realities of life than most genteel brides, was shielded from sexual discussion. The culture of silence ran deep across classes, reinforced by the shared belief that knowledge was dangerous to virtue. And so, when the door of the bridal chamber closed, the bride often faced an ordeal rather than a moment of joy. She was expected to submit to acts she did not understand, with a man who himself may have been guided by misinformation. Many Victorian men had absorbed contradictory messages. On the one hand, that their wives were pure and passionless, on the other, that consummation was a husband's right and duty. This collision of expectations could turn the first night of marriage into a site of confusion, frustration, and even violence. Accounts survive of women fainting, weeping, or resisting in terror. Husbands, baffled by their wives' fear, often attributed it to modesty rather than to the genuine shock of ignorance. The cultural silence had prepared both husband and wife for disappointment. The psychological effects of this dynamic were profound. For many women, the wedding night marked the beginning of a lifelong pattern of endurance. They learned to treat intimacy not as mutual pleasure, but as obligation. Over time, some found ways to carve out companionship and even tenderness with their husbands, but the initial trauma often lingered. Letters from women reveal a sense of betrayal, that the very people who had raised them in innocence had also abandoned them to ignorance. One anonymous Victorian woman wrote in a private diary that her wedding night left her broken of spirit. Thus, the dread of the wedding night was not simply about fear of physical pain, it was the culmination of an entire cultural system. Brides were raised to embody an impossible ideal of angelic purity. They were taught that knowledge was corruption and that passivity was nature. Medicine confirmed that women were supposed to be passionless. Families reinforced silence. And men entered the wedding chamber with expectations shaped by rights, duty, and entitlement rather than mutuality. The wedding night symbolized the moment when all of these forces collided, leaving the woman alone in her ignorance and fear. It was less a beginning of partnership than an initiation into silence and submission. If the cultural and medical forces of the 19th century framed women as passive and ignorant, the law gave these assumptions teeth. In Victorian Britain, the legal structure of marriage itself codified the idea that a wife was not her own person, but her husband's subordinate. This framework made the wedding night a moment not of choice, but of obligation. And it explains why many women dreaded it with a heaviness far deeper than simple fear of the unknown. We begin with the concept of coverture, inherited from centuries of English common law. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, 1765–69, still authoritative in the Victorian period, stated that the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. In practice, this meant that a wife could not own property independently, enter contracts, or sue in her own name. She existed in law only through her husband. This doctrine had profound implications for consent. If a woman's legal existence was merged with her husband's, then her capacity to refuse him was already compromised. The wedding vows themselves symbolized this transfer of identity. A bride was literally giving herself away, with little recognition that she might still retain rights over her body. Out of this framework came the infamous marital rape exemption. The law presumed that a wife gave irrevocable consent to sexual relations at the moment of marriage. The roots of this doctrine can be traced to Sir Matthew Hale, Chief Justice of England in the 17th century, who declared that the husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract the wife hath given herself up to her husband, which she cannot retract. Hale's words echoed into the Victorian period, shaping legal opinion and practice. This presumption meant that on her wedding night, a woman's right to say no was, legally speaking, non-existent. It is no exaggeration to say that the law placed her body under her husband's permanent claim. Whatever anxieties she carried into the bedroom, she knew, consciously or subconsciously, that refusal was not a recognized option. The rhetoric of the time reinforced this legal reality. Advice manuals spoke openly of the husband's rights and the wife's duties. In The Duties of a Wife, 1851, a popular conduct book, the author advised that a good wife never resists the wishes of her husband, for resistance breeds discord, and discord weakens the bonds of love. The language of affection masked the stark truth. Love was defined as submission. Religious discourse added further weight. Anglican sermons on marriage frequently emphasized that the wife must obey, drawing on St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands." To devout Victorian women, religious duty and legal obligation became intertwined. To resist was to sin. What did this mean in practice? For many women, the wedding night became the first moment when these abstract legal and moral doctrines were enacted upon their bodies. If they were unprepared, fearful, or even resistant, their objections carried no legal weight. Husbands, socialized to believe in their rights, often interpreted hesitation as modesty to be overcome rather than refusal to be respected. Diaries and letters capture the dissonance. One woman, writing privately in 1860, described her first night as a terror I dared not speak of, adding that she endured it because it was the law of God and man. Another confessed that she wept through the night, but felt guilty afterward for being an ungrateful wife. Their words show how law and culture fused into a heavy yoke of obligation. For women who found their marriages unbearable, the law offered little recourse. Divorce in England was not even accessible through the civil courts until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. Before that, it required a costly private act of Parliament. Even after 1857, the law was deeply unequal. A man could divorce his wife on grounds of adultery alone, But a woman had to prove adultery combined with additional offenses such as cruelty or desertion. Sexual coercion within marriage was not recognized as cruelty. Thus, for a woman who suffered on her wedding night and continued to suffer afterward, the law provided no exit. She was bound by vows, by coverture, and by the assumption of marital consent. Another layer of the legal structure compounded this dependency: property law, until the Married Women's Property Acts, beginning in 1870 and expanded in 1882, any property a woman owned at the time of marriage became her husband's. Her wages, if she worked, were his. Her body, in legal imagination, was his to claim. This total dependency made refusal or resistance not only legally impossible, but also economically unthinkable. It is no wonder, then, that brides approached their wedding nights with trepidation. They were not entering a partnership between equals. They were entering a contract that erased their independence and placed them under the authority of their husbands in every sphere: legal, economic, and physical. Yet as historians, we must also note the beginnings of resistance. The 1850s and 1860s saw the rise of early feminist voices who began to challenge coverture and marital inequality. Campaigners such as Caroline Norton, herself trapped in a cruel marriage, fought for reforms to property rights and custody laws. Her pamphlets, widely circulated, exposed the injustices of coverture and helped inspire the Married Women's Property Acts. Similarly, debates around the Contagious Diseases Acts, 1864 to 69, revealed growing unease with the state's intrusion into women's bodies. The activist Josephine Butler led a campaign to repeal these laws, arguing passionately that women must have control over their own bodies. Though these movements were often dismissed as radical, they signaled the slow beginning of a shift in how Victorians thought about marriage, consent, and women's rights. To return to the wedding night, for the Victorian woman, the dread was not only cultural or emotional, it was profoundly legal. She knew, or learned quickly, that marriage meant the loss of autonomy. Her body, in the eyes of the law, was not fully her own. If she feared intimacy, if she wished to refuse, if she longed for understanding, none of that mattered legally. The legal doctrine of marital consent turned the wedding night into a ritual of possession. It was not simply about physical intimacy, but about the enactment of law itself. A woman's dread, then, was rational. She was stepping into a contract that would bind her rights, her property, and her body to another person with no real possibility of reclaiming them. To understand fully why so many Victorian women feared their wedding nights, we must turn our attention to the medical establishment of the 19th century. In the Victorian period, medicine was not simply a matter of health. It was also a cultural force that defined morality, reinforced gender roles, and regulated sexuality. Doctors did not merely heal bodies. They interpreted them, disciplined them, and often pathologized them. For women, this meant that their most intimate experiences, including their sexuality, were filtered through a medical discourse that denied their desires, treated their fears as weakness, and justified control by husbands, families, and even the state. No single figure illustrates this better than William Acton, the prominent Victorian physician whose 1857 book, The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs, became widely read. Acton famously claimed that the majority of women, happily for society, to modern readers, this statement seems astonishing in its bluntness, but in its time, it was authoritative. Acton's words were quoted in newspapers, repeated in sermons, and echoed in marriage manuals. His declaration suggested that women who felt no desire were normal, while those who did were aberrations. The implication was clear. If a bride felt fear or disinterest on her wedding night, she was simply behaving as nature intended. This provided husbands with reassurance that their wives' passivity was natural, while it left women who experienced desire feeling guilty, unwomanly, or even pathological. The Victorian medical profession often portrayed female pleasure as dangerous. Doctors warned that women who sought sexual gratification risked overstimulating their nervous systems, leading to hysteria, madness, or infertility. The paradox was striking. Women were told they had little or no natural sexual desire, but if they did, indulging it could make them ill. The result was a medical double bind. A woman who feared her wedding night could justify her fear as modesty or as natural passivity. A woman who desired her husband might suppress that desire to avoid being labeled sick or deviant. Either way, she entered marriage in a climate where her feelings could not be openly acknowledged or affirmed. Central to Victorian medicine was the diagnosis of hysteria, a condition long associated with women and their reproductive organs. Physicians described hysteria as a nervous disorder linked to the womb, manifesting in fainting, anxiety, convulsions, or melancholy. By the mid-19th century, hysteria was used as a catch-all diagnosis for women whose behavior did not conform to expectations. A bride who fainted on her wedding night, who wept uncontrollably, or who resisted her husband might be labeled hysterical. The diagnosis shifted responsibility away from cultural or marital structures and onto the woman's body. Rather than acknowledging her terror as a rational response to ignorance, coercion, or pain, doctors treated it as a medical problem residing in her uterus or nerves. This pathologizing of women's responses silenced them further and made the medical establishment complicit in upholding marital subjugation. Perhaps the most chilling example of medicine's intrusion into female sexuality is the case of Isaac Baker Brown, a London surgeon and one-time president of the Medical Society of London. In the 1860s, Baker Brown promoted clitoridectomy, surgical removal of the clitoris, as a supposed cure for hysteria. His book, On the Curability of Certain Forms of Insanity, Epilepsy, Catalepsy, and Hysteria in Females, 1866, laid out his views in stark detail. Baker Brown argued that sexual excitement damaged women's nervous systems and that removing the clitoris would restore health and morality. Although he was eventually expelled from the Obstetrical Society in 1867 and discredited by his peers, his career reveals how medical authority could redefine women's sexuality as pathology and justify brutal interventions. Even if most brides never faced Baker Brown's knife, the very fact that such ideas circulated underscored how little ownership women had over their own bodies. The Victorian era also saw the rise of gynecology as a distinct medical field. Advances in surgical instruments, anesthesia, and hospital practices allowed doctors to examine, but these developments also gave rise to a culture of control. Speculum examinations, hospital confinement, yet they often reinforced the notion that women's bodies were inherently problematic and in need of regulation. This medical gaze extended into the marital bedroom. If a woman complained of pain during intercourse or expressed reluctance, doctors often prescribed endurance, patience, or submission as remedies. Rarely did they suggest that the husband might need to be more considerate or that female desire was legitimate. The medical profession aligned itself with social norms, framing female suffering as natural and female agency as suspect. Beyond the private sphere, the state enlisted medicine to regulate sexuality through the Contagious Diseases Acts, beginning in 1864. These laws allowed police to detain women suspected of prostitution in garrison towns and ports, subjecting them to compulsory speculum examinations. Women found to have venereal disease could be confined in lock hospitals for months. The acts did not apply to men. Soldiers and sailors who spread infections faced no such surveillance. The laws effectively made women's bodies the site of state control in the name of public health. Although these measures targeted prostitutes, their existence sent a wider cultural message. Women's sexuality was to be monitored, disciplined, and controlled for the sake of men's well-being. Respectable brides, like prostitutes, were reminded that the law and medicine aligned to privilege male needs over female autonomy. So, what did this mean for the bride on her wedding night? She entered her marriage carrying not only cultural silence and legal obligation, but also medical assumptions that denied her agency. If she felt fear, it was seen as modesty. If she felt pain, it was seen as natural. If she fainted or resisted, it was diagnosed as hysteria. If she expressed desire, it was considered pathological. The medical establishment did not protect women from marital dread. It reinforced it. It told them that their bodies were weak, their nerves unstable, and their sexuality either absent or dangerous. It is little wonder that so many brides dreaded their first night of marriage. The authority of doctors, combined with the authority of law and culture, left them with no safe way to claim their own experiences. Yet even in this oppressive climate, resistance stirred. By the 1870s, campaigners like Josephine Butler began to challenge the Contagious Diseases Acts, arguing that the laws degraded women and violated their bodily autonomy. Her campaigns, rooted in both feminism and Christian morality, gave women a voice against medical policing. Similarly, the slow rise of women physicians, such as Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex-Blake, signaled the beginnings of a different medical discourse, one that might someday take women's experiences seriously. Still, for most brides of mid-Victorian England, the medical world was a source of judgment rather than comfort. Their wedding night fears were validated not by empathy, but by diagnoses that treated their dread as proof of womanly weakness. If the law and medicine reinforced a woman's silence on her wedding night, religion added yet another powerful layer of meaning to her fear. Victorian England was saturated with Christian morality, particularly the teachings of the Anglican Church, but also a wide array of dissenting denominations. Sermons, catechisms, and devotional manuals placed marriage at the heart of the moral order, yet they often presented it in ways that intensified women's anxiety. The wedding night in this framework was not just a personal event, but a moment of spiritual consequence, framed by purity, duty, and sin. Marriage in Victorian England was still understood by most as a sacred institution, sanctified by God. In Anglican theology, marriage was not officially one of the 7 sacraments, as in Catholic doctrine, but it retained sacramental qualities in the cultural imagination. The Book of Common Prayer, used in Anglican wedding ceremonies, described marriage as ordained for the procreation of children, for a remedy against sin, and to avoid fornication, and for the mutual society, help, and comfort of the spouses. These words, repeated at countless ceremonies, placed sexual relations firmly within a religious frame. For brides, this meant that their first sexual experience was freighted with moral expectation. It was not simply a private act, but a holy obligation. Failure to submit or embrace the role of wife could be read not only as a social fault, but as a spiritual one. Victorian preachers often drew upon St. Paul's letters to emphasize female submission. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord, reads Ephesians 5:22. Sermons on marriage repeatedly invoked this verse, reinforcing the idea that obedience to a husband was akin to obedience to God. A popular devotional manual, The Christian Lady's Friend, 1849, advised young wives, "Yield in all things lawful to your husband's will, for in so doing you honor God." Such counsel left little room for negotiation or refusal. To resist a husband on the wedding night risked being interpreted as rebellion against divine authority itself. Religious teaching also placed immense weight on female purity. Virginity was not only a social expectation, but a spiritual treasure. Brides were celebrated for their innocence, which was equated with moral worth. In Anglican and evangelical circles, chastity before marriage was often preached as a woman's greatest gift to her husband, proof of her virtue and faith. This emphasis meant that many women walked down the aisle with no understanding of what would follow. To speak of sexual matters was considered unclean, even between mothers and daughters. To be pure was to be silent. And so the first night of marriage often shattered not only personal expectations, but also religiously infused ideals of chastity and innocence. For some women, this sense of purity was so deeply ingrained that sexual intercourse itself seemed sinful even within marriage. One evangelical diarist confessed after her wedding that she felt she had fallen from grace by engaging in physical intimacy despite the church's teaching that sex within marriage was lawful. Her guilt was not logical but deeply emotional, shaped by years of moral instruction that framed sex as dangerous and shameful. The dread of the wedding night was further deepened by religious warnings about the dangers of sin. Victorian sermons warned against lust and carnal indulgence, even within marriage. Husbands were cautioned not to demand too much, and wives were reminded to approach intimacy with modesty and restraint. The Christian family ideal was not one of mutual pleasure, but of carefully managed duty, with strict limits on desire. This moral caution created fear among brides. If they felt desire, they worried about sin. If they felt revulsion, they worried about disobedience. If they resisted, they risked spiritual guilt. Every emotional response seemed to carry moral weight. Clergy often reinforced these anxieties in their pastoral roles. Confession and private counsel sometimes gave young women a chance to ask questions, but the answers were often vague or moralistic. Priests and ministers warned against wifely coldness, but also against excess. The result was a confusing double standard. Wives were told to submit, but not to enjoy too much, to endure, but not to resist. The lack of clarity left many women feeling spiritually inadequate, no matter how they responded. The wedding night, framed as a holy duty, became a test few felt prepared to pass. Religious language itself reinforced these ideals. The bride was often likened to the church, with her husband representing Christ. Hymns and devotional tracts drew on the biblical metaphor of the bride of Christ, emphasizing obedience, reverence, and purity. A Victorian bride might have sung these hymns at services or read these tracts in devotional books, internalizing the image of herself as a figure of submission. This imagery lent grandeur to the institution of marriage, but it also carried a heavy cost. The bride was not seen as a partner, but as a symbol, her role scripted in theological language that left little room for personal agency. We must also remember that Victorian Christianity retained a vivid fear of hell and divine judgment. Moral failures were not simply personal mistakes, but eternal dangers. For women, the fear of sexual sin was particularly acute. To refuse a husband might be rebellion against God, but to embrace desire too fully might be indulgence in sin. The narrow path between these two extremes was poorly defined, leaving brides in a state of moral confusion. Letters and diaries reveal how powerful this fear could be. One bride wrote after her wedding night that she felt the stain of Eve upon her, as though the act of sexual intercourse had awakened sin within her. Such language shows how deeply biblical narratives shaped Victorian women's understanding of their most private experiences. Yet, as in law and medicine, resistance began to emerge within religion itself. Some liberal Anglican and dissenting preachers began to argue for greater tenderness in marriage, emphasizing companionship over submission. The broad church movement, for example, stressed mutual respect and questioned rigid hierarchies. Meanwhile, Quaker communities, though small in number, offered models of marriage that emphasized equality and spiritual partnership. Still, for most Victorian brides, the dominant religious narrative was one of purity submission, and fear of sin. The wedding night was framed as a sacred duty, yet one shrouded in silence and moral anxiety. When we consider the combined effect of these teachings, it becomes clear why religion deepened the dread of the wedding night. Women were taught from childhood that purity was their greatest virtue, that submission was their duty, and that sexual desire was suspect. The wedding night was the moment when all of these teachings converged. It was not merely a private encounter between husband and wife. It was, in the eyes of Victorian society, a spiritual trial. To fail in obedience was to fail God. To desire was to risk sin. To resist was to invite guilt. The religious framework left brides cornered, their personal fears magnified into eternal concerns. To understand why so many Victorian women entered marriage in fear, we must return to their childhoods and adolescence. The dread of the wedding night was not born suddenly at the altar. It was cultivated across years of carefully constructed innocence. Girls were trained from the earliest age to embody purity, modesty, and obedience, while being denied the knowledge that might have empowered them. Their education, whether in elite boarding schools, in middle-class parlors, or in working-class homes, was shaped less by what they were taught than by what was withheld. In 19th-century Britain, the concept of female innocence was elevated to near idolatry. The ideal young woman was chaste in thought as well as deed, untainted by knowledge of sexual matters. This ideal was reinforced by novels, sermons, and conduct manuals. In Charles Dickens' works, for example, heroines like Esther Summerson, Bleak House, and Agnes Wickfield, David Copperfield, embody moral purity and selfless devotion, often defined more by what they endure than by what they understand. Conduct manuals went further. Sarah Stickney Ellis, in her widely read The Women of England, 1839, instructed that a pure and gentle ignorance is the natural charm of the female character. Such advice encouraged families to preserve girls' innocence at all costs. Mothers often avoided frank discussions with daughters, fearing that curiosity itself was dangerous. Girls who asked questions about the body or reproduction were rebuked for impropriety. This culture created a generation of brides who equated ignorance with virtue. To know too much was to risk suspicion. To remain silent was to be praised. Formal education for Victorian girls often reinforced these ideals. In elite boarding schools or through private governesses, young women were taught French, music, embroidery, and watercolor painting. These accomplishments were designed to make them attractive companions, not informed individuals. Scientific or medical knowledge was generally withheld, as it was deemed unsuitable for the female mind. Even middle-class girls, educated at home or in small academies, received little instruction beyond reading, writing, arithmetic, and domestic skills. Lessons in biology or anatomy, if offered at all, were stripped of reproductive detail. Textbooks avoided direct references to sexual organs, replacing them with vague euphemisms or skipping the subject entirely. This omission was deliberate. The goal was not to prepare women for adult life in a practical sense, but to preserve their innocence. As historian Martha Vikernes observes, ignorance was prized as the hallmark of female virtue, and education was structured to maintain it. The family home was the most powerful arena of socialization. Mothers played a key role in transmitting values, but when it came to matters of sexuality, silence was often the rule. Letters and memoirs from Victorian women reveal how common this silence was. One middle-class bride recalled that her mother told her on the eve of her wedding, "You must do your duty as a wife and ask no questions." Another recounted that she learned more about sex from servants' gossip than from her own parents. The silence could be devastating. Girls who began menstruation without prior explanation often believed they were gravely ill or dying. Similarly, on their wedding nights, many were bewildered by the physical act of intercourse. This lack of preparation was not negligence but a cultural norm, designed to preserve their angelic status until marriage. While women were kept in ignorance, men were not. Young men, particularly those of the middle and upper classes, were often introduced to sexual matters in adolescence, whether through schooling, literature, or visits to prostitutes. This created a stark double standard. Husbands often entered marriage with sexual experience, while wives did not even possess the vocabulary to describe what they feared. This disparity exacerbated the dread of the wedding night. Husbands expected compliance, sometimes passion, while wives were unprepared for either. The imbalance of knowledge mirrored the imbalance of power. Literature was another sphere where ignorance was maintained. Works considered improper were censored or withheld from women. Medical texts, novels with frank sexual content, and even Shakespeare's bawdier passages were deemed unsuitable for female readers. Libraries and circulating societies often labeled certain works not for ladies. When medical or anatomical books were published for women, they were couched in moral language. For instance, Dr. Henry Newnham's The Reciprocal Duties of Parents and Children, 1824, warned that too much anatomical detail could corrupt innocence, even as it offered vague advice on female health. Such texts did little to prepare women for the realities of married life. Beyond family and school, social surveillance reinforced the culture of ignorance. A girl's reputation was her most valuable asset, and gossip was a constant threat. To be suspected of immodesty, whether by knowing too much, asking the wrong questions, or showing curiosity, could damage her prospects for marriage. Thus, young women learned to police themselves. They avoided certain topics, suppressed curiosity, and cultivated an appearance of innocence. By the time they reached the altar, this self-policing was second nature. The dread of the wedding night was inseparable from the dread of losing reputation, of being seen as fallen, even within marriage. For many brides, the shock of the wedding night felt like betrayal. They realized that the silence of their upbringing had left them vulnerable. In letters written after marriage, some expressed anger at their mothers for failing to prepare them. One diarist wrote bitterly, "Had I been told, I might have borne it better. Instead, I was thrust into darkness and called to endure." This sense of betrayal reveals the cruelty of the system. What was presented as protection, keeping girls pure and innocent, often led to trauma. The dread of the wedding night was not merely fear of the unknown, but the sudden realization that ignorance had been cultivated deliberately, at the expense of women's well-being. By the mid to late 19th century, reformers began to challenge this system. Campaigners such as Emily Davies and Josephine Butler argued for women's access to higher education and more practical knowledge. The founding of Girton College, Cambridge, 1869, and other women's colleges marked a turning point. Though these institutions focused on academic subjects rather than sexual education, they represented a broader movement toward recognizing women as capable of intellectual and moral independence. Still, the vast majority of brides in the mid-Victorian era remained shaped by the culture of ignorance. Their dread of the wedding night was the product of years of deliberate silence, ornamental education, and social surveillance. In sum, the dread of the wedding night cannot be understood without considering the socialization of Victorian girls. From childhood, they were trained to equate ignorance with virtue, silence with modesty, and submission with duty. Their education prepared them for domestic display, not for physical intimacy. Their families withheld knowledge, and society rewarded them for not knowing. Thus, when the wedding night arrived, they faced not only a new husband, but the collapse of a lifelong illusion. The fear was not just of sex itself, but of what it revealed, that their innocence had been less a treasure than a prison, and that the silence of their upbringing had left them defenseless. The wedding night cannot be understood without first examining the path that led brides to the altar, the elaborate rituals of Victorian courtship and engagement. If childhood and education had prepared girls to be innocent, then courtship shaped them into symbols of romantic devotion. The problem was that these rituals constructed expectations of love and intimacy that bore little resemblance to the realities of married sexuality. The dissonance between romance and reality often turned the wedding night into a moment of disillusion, intensifying the fear and dread women felt. Victorian courtship was governed by strict rules. A man could not simply call upon a young woman. He had to be introduced by a mutual acquaintance and invited into her home by her parents. Meetings were supervised, chaperones ubiquitous. Courtship was a public performance, designed to display a man's financial stability and a woman's gentility. Courtship manuals emphasized restraint and decorum. Hints on Courtship and Marriage, 1838, warned men against being too forward, while advising women to cultivate modest reserve. Romantic gestures were carefully staged: a walk in the garden, the exchange of poems, the gift of a pressed flower or a lock of hair. Physical contact was minimal, often limited to holding hands or the occasional brush of a glove. This system created an image of love that was idealized, delicate, and almost ethereal. For women, the suitor was a figure of admiration and respect, not of physical desire. Courtship taught them to expect romance without passion, companionship without touch. Once a proposal was accepted, the engagement period carried its own rituals and restrictions. Couples were allowed more privacy, but expectations of modesty remained strict. Letters between engaged couples often overflowed with sentimental language, calling the beloved angel, darling, or treasure, but rarely mentioning physical intimacy. Engaged women were celebrated as brides-to-be, showered with gifts and social attention. They embroidered their trousseaux, prepared their households, and basked in the admiration of their circles. Yet they remained largely ignorant of what marriage would demand physically. Mothers sometimes offered cryptic advice: be patient, think first of his happiness, or remember your vows. Few explained the mechanics of sexual union. This prolonged engagement, filled with romance and anticipation but shrouded in silence about sex, left many women entering marriage with expectations that were bound to be disappointed. The very language of Victorian romance heightened the contrast. Lovers compared their affection to flowers, stars, angels, and holy devotion. The beloved was idealized as pure and ethereal. The act of intercourse, earthly, physical, and often painful for the inexperienced bride, clashed violently with this elevated imagery. For many women, the wedding night shattered the illusion. The man who had written tender letters and recited poetry became a figure of urgency, claiming physical rights she had not imagined. The transition from romantic suitor to sexual husband was abrupt, confusing, and often traumatic. We must also recognize that courtship itself was a performance. Men displayed their financial stability, women their gentility, families their social networks. Courtship rarely revealed the full personality of either partner. Many couples married after relatively short engagements, having spent little time truly alone together. Thus, the wedding night often brought not only sexual revelation, but also personal disillusionment. Women discovered sides of their husbands they had never seen: impatience, ignorance, even aggression. Husbands, too, were often bewildered by their wives' fear or reluctance. Both entered marriage unprepared, shaped more by social performance than by honest intimacy. Popular literature also shaped women's expectations. Romantic novels of the early 19th century, from Sir Walter Scott to Charlotte Brontë, presented love as a grand, often spiritualized force. In Jane Eyre, 1847, for example, the love between Jane and Rochester is portrayed as deeply moral and transcendent, yet Brontë avoids explicit description of physical passion. The same was true of many Victorian novels, which ended at the altar and left what followed to the imagination. For women raised on such stories, the wedding night was an abrupt confrontation with realities that literature had never prepared them for. Their dread was not simply fear of pain, but fear of the collapse of the romantic ideals they had been taught to cherish. Another key factor was social surveillance. During courtship, a woman's behavior was closely watched. Families, servants, neighbors, and even acquaintances monitored her conduct for signs of impropriety. A young woman who showed too much interest in a suitor risked being labeled forward. One who showed too little risked losing her match. This constant surveillance trained women to suppress any physical desire they might have felt. They learned to blush, to avert their eyes, to cultivate modest reserve. By the time of marriage, these habits of repression were deeply ingrained. On the wedding night, when they were suddenly expected to embrace physical intimacy, the reversal was jarring. The rituals of courtship and engagement culminated in the wedding day itself, which marked the symbolic transition from girlhood to womanhood. Brides were celebrated as paragons of purity, dressed in white to symbolize chastity. The ceremony emphasized obedience and duty. The community gathered to witness the transformation. Yet the transition was abrupt. A woman who had been shielded, supervised, and celebrated for her innocence was suddenly expected within hours to perform marital duties with no preparation. The gap between public ritual and private reality was immense. For many women, it was a leap into the unknown, one that inspired dread rather than joy. It is also important to note that courtship shaped men's expectations differently. While women were trained to suppress desire, men were often encouraged to view marriage as the rightful outlet for their passions. Conduct books advised men to be patient with their wives, but also affirmed their conjugal rights. Courtship created a romantic ideal, but marriage was expected to fulfill physical needs. This imbalance intensified the shock of the wedding night. Men often assumed their wives' reluctance was modesty, to be overcome with persistence. Women experienced this persistence as pressure or coercion. The very structures of courtship had prepared both partners for disappointment and misunderstanding. Thus, the dread of the wedding night was magnified by the disillusionment that followed courtship. Women who had been courted with flowers, poetry, and chivalric gestures found themselves in situations of pain, fear, or confusion. Husbands who expected compliance found themselves faced with tears or resistance. The gap between romance and reality was vast, and it often fell on women to bridge it in silence. By the late Victorian period, some writers began to critique these rituals. George Eliot's novels, for instance, depicted marriage as a complex and often disappointing reality, contrasting with the illusions of courtship. Feminist reformers argued that the culture of romantic idealization harmed women by keeping them ignorant and unprepared. Slowly, these critiques laid the groundwork for change. But in mid-Victorian England, the dominant pattern remained intact. Courtship was romance, marriage was duty, and the wedding night was the collision point where illusions shattered. In sum, Victorian courtship rituals set women up for fear and disappointment. They created expectations of love that were sentimental, spiritual, and romantic, while keeping women ignorant of the physical realities of marriage. They trained women to suppress desire and men to assert rights. They turned courtship into a performance and left marriage as a revelation. The dread of the wedding night was not simply fear of pain, but fear of disillusionment. The realization that the romance of engagement was a fragile veil over the stark realities of marital life. The dread of the Victorian wedding night was not only cultural, legal, and religious, it was also physical and theatrical. The very setting of the bridal chamber, the rituals, the clothing, the furnishings, and the expectations that swirled around it helped shape women's experiences. If courtship had elevated women into romantic ideals and the law had bound them to obedience, Then the bridal chamber was the stage on which those ideals and obligations were enacted. The dread was sharpened by the material realities of the space itself: the bed, the corset, the nightgown, the gaze of the household, and the pressure of ceremony. Victorian weddings were public spectacles, but the bridal chamber was a private ritual with its own choreography. In wealthier households, it was not unusual for the bride and groom to be escorted ceremonially to their chamber after the festivities. Family members might linger outside, servants might prepare the bed, and the household often waited expectantly for the marriage to be consummated. This sense of surveillance, even if indirect, created enormous pressure. Diaries suggest that brides felt they were performing for more than just their husbands. They were performing for their families, their communities, and even God. One anonymous bride in the 1860s confessed in her journal that she felt watched though the door was closed, as if my modesty were on trial. The chamber thus became less a place of intimacy than a theatre where purity and obedience were tested. The clothing of the bride also contributed to her fear. The white wedding dress, popularized after Queen Victoria's 1840 marriage to Prince Albert, symbolized virginity and innocence. While the gown dazzled in the church and reception hall, it also reinforced the message that the bride was pure and untouched. The symbolism carried into the chamber. Brides often reported feeling that disrobing was itself a kind of shame, a stripping away not only of clothing but of virtue. A trousseau might include dozens of carefully embroidered chemises and nightgowns. Yet these garments could feel alien to women unaccustomed to associating their bodies with sexuality. For many, the very act of undressing in front of a man for the first time was terrifying, a collision between modesty and duty. The white dress, once a symbol of pride, became a reminder of the innocence now being surrendered. The corset, a staple of Victorian fashion, added another layer of difficulty. Tight-laced to shape the waist into the fashionable hourglass silhouette, corsets restricted movement and breathing. On the wedding night, brides faced the awkward task of removing or loosening these elaborate garments, often with the help of their husbands. The corset symbolized control and restraint, but in the bridal chamber it became an obstacle to intimacy. For women raised to prize modesty, the act of loosening the corset was deeply exposing. For men, unfastening it could feel like a claim of possession. The garment itself embodied the tension between repression and desire that defined Victorian sexuality. The bed was the centerpiece of the bridal chamber, both materially and symbolically. In wealthier households, four-poster beds draped in heavy curtains dominated the room. In middle-class homes, brass or iron bedsteads were common, adorned with counterpanes embroidered by the bride herself. The bed was not just furniture. It was a stage on which the marriage contract was enacted. In some traditions, evidence of consummation, such as blood-stained sheets, was even inspected as proof of virginity. Though this practice was more common in continental Europe than in Britain, nonetheless, the expectation lingered. The bed was where purity was tested and possession confirmed. For brides, the sight of the bed could provoke dread. It symbolized the unknown, the loss of innocence, and the beginning of obligations they did not fully understand. The bridal chamber was rarely as private as modern readers might assume. Servants prepared the room, sometimes even undressing the bride. Family members might make jokes, toast the couple, or drop hints as the newlyweds withdrew. In some country households, the marriage bed was placed in a shared room or within earshot of relatives. This lack of privacy intensified the pressure. Women knew that the household awaited news of consummation. The community might gossip if the couple delayed. The expectation was that proof of union should be immediate. For brides already fearful, the sense of being watched, even indirectly, turned dread into panic. When the moment arrived, ignorance compounded fear. Many women had no knowledge of anatomy or sexual function. They often associated intercourse with pain, blood, or even danger to their health. Some fainted from shock, others wept through the night. Husbands, equally unprepared, sometimes approached the act with clumsy insistence, interpreting resistance as coyness. The medical assumption that women were naturally passionless further silenced their complaints. If a bride protested, she was told that modesty was natural and that pain would pass. Few recognized her fear as legitimate. The chamber became a place of endurance, not of discovery. While these dynamics were common across classes, variations existed. Elite brides might face the most elaborate ceremonies, with greater surveillance and higher expectations of purity. Middle-class brides, though less publicly scrutinized, were deeply shaped by ideals of respectability. Working-class brides often had more practical experiences of sexuality before marriage, particularly in rural areas, but they too were influenced by cultural ideals of female modesty. Regardless of class, the bridal chamber was a charged space where fear, ignorance, and expectation collided. The aftermath of the first night often lingered. Some women described feeling alienated from their husbands, unable to reconcile the romantic suitor with the sexual partner. Others reported physical pain that lasted for weeks. The chamber, meant to symbolize the beginning of union, sometimes became the site of distance and mistrust. For many, the dread of the wedding night extended into the early months of marriage, creating a cycle of anxiety and endurance. Some women eventually adjusted, others remained resentful, and still others embraced motherhood as a way to shift attention from marital intimacy to child-rearing. In some, the bridal chamber amplified the fears women carried into marriage. The rituals surrounding it turned intimacy into performance. The clothing made exposure awkward and humiliating. The bed symbolized obligation more than comfort. The presence of servants and family created an atmosphere of surveillance, and the physical encounter itself, shaped by ignorance and inequality, often confirmed women's worst fears. The dread of the wedding night was not abstract. It was enacted in the very space where brides were expected to transform from virgins into wives. The chamber, rather than a sanctuary, became a stage of fear. For the Victorian bride, the dread of the wedding night did not end with the act of consummation itself. Hovering over that first experience of marital intimacy was a looming spectre: pregnancy. In an era before reliable contraception, before safe obstetric practices, and before modern understandings of women's reproductive health, the wedding night marked not just the beginning of sexual union, but the beginning of a life fraught with the dangers of childbirth. The knowledge, or at least the whispered awareness, that intimacy could lead to pregnancy often deepened women's anxiety. The bridal chamber thus carried not only the weight of duty, but the shadow of mortality. By the mid-19th century, most women understood, at least in vague terms, that marriage would bring children. The Book of Common Prayer itself stated that marriage was ordained for the procreation of children. Families and communities celebrated fertility as a wife's primary duty. Yet what brides often knew in equal measure, sometimes whispered by mothers, sometimes gleaned from gossip, was that childbirth was perilous. Maternal mortality in Victorian Britain remained alarmingly high. Estimates suggest that between 1 in 200 and 1 in 300 women died in childbirth during the mid-19th century, a figure that made pregnancy one of the most dangerous conditions a woman could face. Even those who survived often endured lasting injuries such as prolapse, fistula, or chronic pain. Childbearing was thus not merely a duty, but a risk that could shadow every sexual encounter. Despite the dangers, frank discussion of pregnancy and childbirth was rare. Respectable women did not speak openly about reproductive matters. Pregnant women often retreated from public life, cloaking their condition in euphemisms, such as being in a delicate state. This silence meant that girls entering marriage often had only the vaguest sense of what pregnancy entailed, let alone childbirth. When they did hear stories, they were often terrifying. Servants, midwives, or female relatives might recount tales of long labors, hemorrhages, or deaths in childbed. For a bride who had just endured the shock of consummation, the realization that the act could lead to such ordeals was profoundly unsettling. Religious teaching amplified these fears by framing childbirth as a divinely ordained trial. The curse of Eve in Genesis, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children," was often cited in sermons and religious tracts. Anglican and evangelical writers alike described childbirth as a woman's cross to bear, a test of her faith and obedience. This theological framing offered spiritual consolation but little practical comfort. For women who dreaded pregnancy, it meant that fear itself could feel like a failure of faith. The wedding night thus became the moment when women stepped into Eve's shadow, inheriting the pain of original sin. By the mid-Victorian period, childbirth was becoming increasingly medicalized. Male physicians began to replace traditional midwives, bringing new instruments and interventions into the birthing room. The use of forceps was common, but it carried risks of injury to both mother and child. Anesthesia, in the form of chloroform or ether, the unpredictability of childbirth, combined with the growing yet imperfect role of medicine, kept fear alive. Beyond physical fear, brides also worried about the economic consequences of pregnancy. Middle-class women, whose respectability was tied to domesticity, were expected to bear multiple children. Families often idealized large households, yet the financial burden of feeding, clothing, and educating many children could be immense. Working-class women faced even harsher realities. Repeated pregnancies meant more mouths to feed on already meager wages. The wedding night thus carried not only the promise of motherhood, but the specter of hardship. For many women, each sexual encounter represented the possibility of another dependent child, another risk to health, another strain on resources. Contraception existed in Victorian Britain, but it was shrouded in secrecy and stigma. Methods such as withdrawal, sponges, and condoms were known but rarely discussed openly. Publications like Charles Knowlton's Fruits of Philosophy, 1832, promoted birth control, but were prosecuted under obscenity laws. The 1877 trial of Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant for publishing a new edition of Knowlton's book demonstrated the extent to which contraception was seen as scandalous and immoral. This climate left respectable women with little access to reliable contraceptive information. Even if they knew of methods, many feared using them, lest they be judged immoral or unladylike. For most, the wedding night was inseparable from the risk of pregnancy, and contraception offered little reassurance. The psychological toll of this constant fear was profound. Brides entered marriage already anxious about sex itself. The added weight of possible pregnancy made the dread overwhelming. Diaries and letters record women weeping at the thought of bearing child after child, or confessing terror at the possibility of dying in childbirth. One middle-class woman wrote in 1858 that she trembled with every monthly change, knowing it might herald 9 months of fear. Another confessed after her first pregnancy, not from lack of affection, but from fear of being thrust again into the valley of death. Fear of being thrust again into the valley of death. Victorian literature often reinforced these fears. Novels like Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, 1855, and George Eliot's Middlemarch, 1871-72, depicted women dying in childbirth or suffering greatly from repeated pregnancies. Such stories reflected reality. The frequency of maternal mortality meant that nearly every family had first-hand knowledge of a woman lost in childbed. These narratives were cautionary reminders for brides. The wedding night was not just about intimacy, it was the gateway to these risks. Taken together, these factors meant that the wedding night was not a singular moment, but a threshold. It marked not only the end of virginity, but the beginning of a reproductive career. Brides knew, or soon discovered, that they were stepping into a life of near-constant pregnancies, with all the dangers and burdens they entailed. The dread, therefore, was not limited to the act itself. It was the dread of what might follow: pain, danger, death, or endless cycles of motherhood. In this sense, the bridal chamber was haunted by the cries of mothers and infants, by the knowledge that sex was inseparable from reproduction, and reproduction inseparable from risk. In some, the shadow of pregnancy intensified Victorian women's dread of the wedding night. They faced not only the ignorance of sex and the obligations of law and religion, but also the very real possibility of death in childbirth, injury, or economic hardship. Without contraception, without open discussion, and with limited medical support, every sexual encounter carried a heavy price. The bridal chamber, already a stage of fear, became also a gateway to suffering. To dread the wedding night was, in many ways, to dread the long shadow of childbearing that stretched ahead. The wedding night was not a one-time ordeal for Victorian brides. It marked the beginning of a lifelong expectation, the duty of sexual submission. In the 19th century, marriage was not seen as a partnership of equals, but as a hierarchy in which the husband held authority and the wife owed obedience. This imbalance was expressed most starkly in the concept of conjugal rights, a phrase that gave legal and cultural weight to the husband's claim over his wife's body. Conduct manuals, sermons, and medical texts all reinforced the idea that sex within marriage was the wife's obligation. Manuals such as The Duties of a Wife, 1851, advised women to yield to their husbands' desires without complaint. Religious writings echoed this sentiment, stressing that a wife's refusal could provoke discord or even sin. The language of duty transformed intimacy into obligation. For husbands, conjugal rights were a guarantee. For wives, they were a burden. If a woman resisted, she was not only defying her husband, but also undermining the sanctity of marriage itself. The idea of mutual consent, central to modern understandings of intimacy, was almost entirely absent from Victorian discourse. In law, conjugal rights carried sharp consequences. Courts recognized the husband's right to sexual access to his wife as inherent in marriage. If a wife attempted to live apart, he could sue for restitution of conjugal rights, compelling her to return and resume marital duties. Such cases appear regularly in mid-19th century legal records. One notorious example is the 1867 case of Archer versus Archer, in which a husband sought restitution against his wife, who had left him alleging cruelty. The court ordered her to return, emphasizing that refusal of marital duties was not sufficient grounds for separation. The doctrine of conjugal rights meant that a wife's body was legally bound to her husband, regardless of her feelings. This legal framework ensured that the dread of the wedding night extended into the dread of ongoing marriage. Women knew that submission was not optional. It was the law. The most extreme consequence of conjugal rights was the marital rape exemption. As we saw earlier, jurist Sir Matthew Hale had declared centuries before that a husband could not be guilty of raping his wife. This doctrine persisted well into the 19th century, shaping Victorian understandings of marriage. What this meant in practice was stark. A wife had no legal recourse if her husband forced himself upon her. Courts treated sex as part of the marital contract, permanently consented to at the altar. Only in cases of extreme violence might the law intervene, and even then the threshold was high. This reality made the dread of the wedding night not just a fear of initiation, but of permanence. Once the vows were spoken, a woman had no recognized right to say no. Medicine and religion reinforced these legal expectations. Doctors advised women to fulfill their conjugal duties, warning that refusal could harm the husband's health. Some even argued that male sexual frustration led to illness or infidelity, placing responsibility for male well-being squarely on the wife. Religious texts likewise stressed obedience. Evangelical tracts urged wives to sacrifice their comfort for their husband's needs, portraying submission as a Christian duty. The combination of medical and religious authority left women with little room to articulate their own needs. For many women, the duty of submission meant enduring repeated pregnancies. With little access to contraception, marital sex often led to large families. Middle-class women might bear 6 or more children. Working-class women often bore even more. Each pregnancy carried risks, both physical and economic. The expectation of conjugal rights thus condemned many women to cycles of fear and exhaustion. Letters and diaries record wives begging for respite, dreading the physical toll of another pregnancy, yet feeling powerless to refuse their husbands. The psychological impact of conjugal rights was profound. Women often learned to disassociate from their own desires and needs, treating intimacy as a duty to be endured rather than an experience to be shared. Some developed what today might be described as depression or anxiety, manifesting in melancholy, fatigue, or illness. Contemporary observers sometimes describe such women as invalids, confined to bed with vague ailments. Historians now suggest that some of these cases reflected the toll of repeated pregnancies, sexual coercion, and lack of autonomy. The label of invalidism allowed women to withdraw from conjugal duties, but at the cost of being seen as weak or sickly. Although refusal was legally and socially difficult, there were rare instances of resistance. Some women used illness as a shield, claiming fragile health to avoid sexual relations. Others turned to religious devotion, framing abstinence as a form of spiritual purity. A few sought legal separation, though success was rare. These exceptions highlight the broader reality. The system made resistance almost impossible. For most women, refusal was unthinkable, and the dread of intimacy became a permanent feature of married life. By the later 19th century, critiques of conjugal rights began to emerge. Feminist campaigners such as Josephine Butler and Frances Power Cobb argued that marriage should be based on mutual respect rather than coercion. Their voices were radical in their time, often dismissed as scandalous or unfeminine, yet they planted seeds of change, challenging the assumption that conjugal rights were natural or moral. These critiques foreshadowed later reforms in the 20th century, though Victorian women themselves remained bound by the doctrine. In the end, the dread of the wedding night was magnified by the knowledge that it was not a one-time ordeal, but the beginning of a lifetime of obligation. The law granted husbands conjugal rights. Medicine and religion reinforced them. Society praised wives who submitted and condemned those who resisted. For many women, this meant living with a constant undercurrent of fear. Fear of pregnancy, fear of illness, fear of coercion. The wedding night was the first step into a life defined not by choice, but by duty. By the time a Victorian bride endured her wedding night, her fear did not vanish. It often deepened into a long-term pattern of dread, anxiety, and resignation. For many women, the initiation into marital sex marked the beginning of a lifetime in which intimacy was framed as duty, pregnancy loomed as a threat, and refusal was nearly impossible. The consequences were not only physical, but profoundly emotional and psychological. Out of this web of obligations emerged the archetype of the Victorian invalid woman, frail, melancholy, withdrawn, and defined by suffering. This invalidism was not always rooted in identifiable disease. Often it was the body's protest against the weight of sexual and marital expectations. Victorian England was notorious for its cult of invalidism, particularly among middle and upper-class women. Physicians described women as inherently fragile, prone to nervous collapse, hysteria, and weakness of constitution. Female invalids became cultural figures, pale, languid, confined to couches, their fragility romanticized in literature and art. But beneath the aesthetic of delicate womanhood lay real suffering. For many women, repeated pregnancies, coerced sexual encounters, and lack of autonomy manifested in exhaustion and depression. Invalidism offered a socially acceptable way to withdraw from conjugal duties without openly defying them. A woman who was too unwell could retreat from the marital bed while still preserving her reputation as dutiful. Doctors of the period increasingly diagnosed women with nervous disorders, a broad category that encompassed everything from headaches and fatigue to anxiety and despair. Melancholy, a term we might equate with depression, was frequently attributed to women who expressed sadness or withdrawal. Medical journals often treated these conditions as evidence of women's inherent weakness rather than as responses to social conditions. Yet when we examine women's letters and diaries, we see that many traced their suffering directly to marital life. Some wrote of dread at their husbands' advances, others of despair at repeated pregnancies, and still others of the silence that forced them to suffer without complaint. At the heart of much invalidism was the reality of sexual coercion. Because refusal was not legally or socially recognized, many women endured sexual relations even when they feared or resented them. Over time, this constant violation of bodily autonomy eroded their mental health. One diarist in the 1870s confessed that she had grown pale and weak because she could not bear to be near him, but dared not resist. Another admitted that she feigned illness to avoid her husband, noting bitterly that "it is my only weapon, and it is a poor one." These accounts reveal the link between sexual duty and psychological collapse. While invalidism was often a prison, it could also be a form of resistance. By adopting the role of the invalid, some women carved out space for themselves in lives otherwise dominated by duty. A sickroom could become a refuge, granting them reprieve from marital demands. Husbands faced with wives who were too fragile for intimacy sometimes relented. Literature reflects this dynamic. In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's later short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, 1892, though American rather than British, the protagonist's descent into madness is framed by medical confinement, symbolizing the entrapment of countless women who were silenced and pathologized. British accounts, though often less overt, resonate with similar themes. For many women, silence itself became a survival strategy. They did not openly resist or articulate their dread. Instead, they buried their fears beneath the veneer of respectability. Letters between female friends sometimes hint at shared suffering, using euphemisms such as weariness, delicacy, or trouble of the nerves. These coded words masked experiences of coercion, pregnancy, and despair. Silence was reinforced by the fear of scandal. To complain openly about a husband's demands risked shame, isolation, or even accusations of madness. Better to remain silent, to endure, to adopt the mask of the angelic wife. Victorian literature often mirrored these realities, portraying wives as fragile or doomed. In Thomas Hardy's novels, women like Tess in Tess of the d'Urbervilles, 1891, embody the tragic consequences of sexual vulnerability. In George Eliot's Middlemarch, 1871-72, Dorothea Brooke's marriage to Casaubon becomes a tale of intellectual and emotional suffocation, reflecting the despair many wives felt when romance dissolved into duty. These narratives were not merely artistic devices. They reflected lived experiences of countless women. The melancholy wife was not an invention, but a recognizable social type, produced by the culture of conjugal rights and silence. Ironically, medicine often perpetuated the very suffering it claimed to treat. Doctors prescribed rest cures, seclusion, or tonics rather than addressing the underlying causes of women's distress. Some even recommended more frequent marital relations, claiming that a wife's coldness was a cause of her illness rather than a symptom of coercion. The case of Isaac Baker Brown, who performed clitoridectomies to cure hysteria, is an extreme example of how medicine pathologized women's suffering while denying their voices. Less drastic, but equally harmful, were the countless prescriptions that treated women's dread as weakness rather than as rational protest. The emotional costs of marital duty were not confined to the elite. Working-class women, though less idealized as fragile invalids, suffered their own forms of despair. For them, repeated pregnancies combined with poverty created crushing burdens. Oral histories and working-class memoirs reveal women who dreaded their husbands' advances because each encounter meant another mouth to feed. Middle-class women, meanwhile, bore the dual burden of repeated childbearing and the expectation of genteel fragility. Invalidism was more common in their class, both as a response to suffering and as a role society allowed them to inhabit. By the late 19th century, critiques of women's suffering grew louder. Feminists, such as Frances Power Cobbe, condemned marital coercion as wife torture. Campaigners like Josephine Butler highlighted the hypocrisy of laws that policed prostitutes while ignoring the suffering of wives. These voices began to connect women's psychological distress to systemic injustice rather than to inherent weakness. Nevertheless, the majority of women remained trapped in silence. Their dread of the wedding night evolved into a lifetime of endurance, with invalidism, melancholy, and suffering serving as unspoken testaments to the costs of Victorian marriage. The dread of the wedding night cannot be understood in isolation. It was the beginning of a pattern that stretched across women's lives. What began as fear in the bridal chamber often matured into melancholy, invalidism, or silent endurance. The emotional consequences were not incidental. They were central to the Victorian female experience. The image of the pale, fragile, invalid wife, so common in literature and art, was not simply a stereotype, but a cultural reality, born out of systems that silenced women, denied their autonomy, and demanded their submission. Behind every such figure lay a story of a wedding night, dreaded, endured, and remembered. By the final decades of the 19th century, the systems that had bound Victorian women to fear, silence, and submission began to be questioned. The dread of the wedding night, once accepted as private anguish, was increasingly recognized by reformers as a symptom of systemic injustice. Feminists, social activists, and sympathetic writers raised their voices against the cultural, medical, and legal structures that had normalized women's suffering. Their critiques did not dismantle the system overnight, but they planted seeds of change that would eventually reshape ideas of marriage, consent, and sexuality in the modern era. One of the most outspoken critics of marital coercion was Frances Power Cobbe, an Irish feminist, journalist, and social reformer. In 1878, she published an essay titled "Wife Torture in England" in the Contemporary Review. In it, she condemned not only domestic violence, but also the broader legal framework that left women vulnerable. Cobbe argued that the doctrine of conjugal rights reduced women to slaves of the marriage bed, forced to submit to their husbands regardless of their own will. Her choice of the phrase "wife torture" was deliberate and shocking. It reframed what society had long accepted as marital duty into an act of violence. Cobb's article provoked outrage among conservatives, but resonated deeply with reform-minded readers. For the first time, the dread of the wedding night and the suffering that followed were being named not as natural facts, but as injustices. Josephine Butler, another towering figure of Victorian feminism, focused her activism on the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws, passed in the 1860s, allowed police to detain women suspected of prostitution and subject them to compulsory medical examinations. Men, however, faced no such scrutiny. Butler argued that the acts not only degraded women, but also reinforced the sexual double standard that underpinned marriage itself. She linked the treatment of prostitutes to the plight of wives, both subjected to a system that prioritized male desire over female autonomy. Butler's campaign succeeded in securing the repeal of the Acts in 1886, a landmark victory that signaled a shift in public attitudes toward women's rights over their own bodies. Alongside sexual reform came legal campaigns for women's rights within marriage. Caroline Norton, trapped in an abusive marriage, used her personal experience to argue for legal reform. Her pamphlets, such as English Laws for Women in the 19th Century, 1854, exposed the injustices of coverture and helped inspire the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882. These reforms allowed women to retain ownership of their earnings and property, eroding the doctrine that had treated wives as legally absorbed into their husbands. While the laws did not address sexual rights directly, they marked a crucial step toward recognizing women as independent legal persons. By challenging the economic foundations of marital inequality, they also laid the groundwork for questioning sexual subordination. Victorian literature played a vital role in articulating dissent. Writers such as George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, and later Thomas Hardy used their novels to expose the limitations of marriage as it was practiced. In Middlemarch, 1871-72, Eliot portrayed Dorothea Brooke's marriage to Casaubon as a trap, suffocating her intellect and spirit. Gaskell's novels depicted women struggling under the burdens of repeated pregnancies and social expectation. Hardy's Tess of the d'Urbervilles, 1891, highlighted the devastating consequences of sexual coercion and societal hypocrisy. These works resonated because they reflected truths readers recognized in their own lives. By portraying marriage not as bliss but as struggle, literature helped shift cultural attitudes. It encouraged readers to see women's suffering not as inevitable but as unjust. By the 1880s and 1890s, a new cultural figure emerged, the new woman. Educated, independent, and assertive, the new woman rejected the ideals of the submissive wife and the angel in the house. She appeared in novels, essays, and debates, often sparking controversy. Writers like Sarah Grand, in her essay The New Aspect of the Woman Question, 1894, argued that women must claim control over their own bodies and destinies. The new woman challenged not only economic and political inequalities, but also sexual double standards. She refused to see marriage as inevitable and demanded the right to marry, or not marry, on her own terms. Although many Victorians ridiculed the new woman as unfeminine or dangerous, her very existence signaled that the culture of silence was breaking down. For the first time, public debate openly addressed the question of women's autonomy over sex and marriage. The entry of women into the medical profession also helped shift discourse. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Britain's first female physician, and Sophia Jex-Blake, a pioneer of women's medical education, challenged male dominance in medicine. They not only provided healthcare to women, but also advocated for more honest discussions about female physiology. While early women doctors did not openly campaign against conjugal rights, their presence itself was transformative. They legitimized women's knowledge of their own bodies and created spaces where female patients could speak more freely. Over time, this undermined the medical silencing that had reinforced women's dread of intimacy. Toward the end of the Victorian period, debates about consent began to surface. The 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, which raised the age of consent from 13 to 16, reflected growing concern about sexual exploitation. While the law primarily addressed prostitution and child protection, it also reflected a cultural shift. Society was beginning to acknowledge that consent mattered. Though the marital rape exemption remained unchallenged until much later, the broader conversation about consent planted seeds that would eventually expand into the marital sphere. Reformers argued that true morality required respect for women's will, not just control over their bodies. It must be emphasized, however, that these voices of resistance were exceptions, not the rule. Women who spoke openly about sexual injustice risked scandal, ostracism, or ridicule. Cobb, Butler, and others were denounced as radicals who undermined the family and the moral order. Literature that critiqued marriage often faced censorship or backlash, yet their courage mattered. By naming women's suffering as injustice, they gave language to what had long been endured in silence. Their work created cracks in the edifice of Victorian marital ideology, through which later generations would push for change. For Victorian women who dreaded their wedding nights, reform came too slowly to change their immediate reality. But the voices of resistance mattered because they began to shift public discourse. They challenged the assumption that women's dread was natural. They exposed the hypocrisy of laws and medical practices that silenced women. They insisted that marriage should be reimagined as a partnership rather than a hierarchy. The dread of the wedding night, once hidden behind closed doors, became a symbol of the injustices reformers sought to challenge. It was no longer merely a private fear, it was a political issue. Across the previous segments, we have journeyed through the cultural landscape of Victorian England, tracing the roots of women's fear of the wedding night. What began as the tremor of a single evening often stretched into lifetimes of silence, invalidism, and endurance. Now, as historians, we must gather the threads together: law, religion, medicine, education, courtship, the bridal chamber, pregnancy, conjugal rights, and the first voices of reform. By synthesizing these elements, we can see that Victorian women's dread was not irrational. It was the rational response of human beings confronted with a system designed to deny their agency. The law provided the skeletal frame of women's subjugation. Under coverture, a wife's legal identity dissolved into that of her husband. Conjugal rights ensured that her body was considered permanently available, while the marital rape exemption rendered refusal legally impossible. Courts could compel wives to return to their husbands, and divorce remained prohibitively difficult until the late century. The wedding night, therefore, was not merely a private initiation but a legal enactment. With consummation, the woman stepped into a contract that bound her body, property, and autonomy to her husband. The dread she felt was the recognition, even if only dimly understood, that she was crossing a threshold from which there was little return. Religion draped this legal framework in sacred language. Anglican and evangelical teachings emphasized wifely submission, purity, and obedience. The Book of Common Prayer described marriage as a remedy against sin and a duty to procreation. Sermons invoke St. Paul's commands for wives to obey their husbands as unto the Lord. For brides, this meant that refusal was not only unlawful but sinful. Desire was suspect, modesty was praised, and the very act of sex, though sanctified in marriage, was shadowed by guilt and shame. The wedding night became a test of spiritual as well as marital duty, leaving women burdened with the fear of sin, no matter how they responded. Medicine reinforced these obligations by pathologizing women's experiences. Physicians like William Acton declared women naturally passionless, turning their silence into medical fact. Hysteria diagnoses silenced women who resisted, while figures like Isaac Baker Brown proposed surgical mutilation to cure female sexuality. The medicalization of childbirth added another layer of dread. Maternal mortality remained high, and interventions often worsened outcomes. The prospect of pregnancy made every sexual encounter a risk, sometimes a mortal one. For women, the wedding night was not simply intimacy, it was the opening of a reproductive career marked by danger. The dread was cultivated long before the wedding day. From girlhood, women were taught that ignorance was virtue. Schools emphasized accomplishments, music, French, embroidery, over science or anatomy. Mothers, bound by propriety, withheld explanations. Literature idealized romantic love, but stopped short at the altar, leaving brides with illusions of devotion, but no understanding of sex. By the time they entered the bridal chamber, many women were utterly unprepared. Their ignorance was celebrated, yet it left them defenseless. The dread of the wedding night was the direct fruit of a system that prized innocence over knowledge. Courtship rituals heightened the dissonance. Suited in romance and poetry, women were courted as angels, pure and delicate. Engagements reinforced this sentimental ideal. Yet the transition from courtship to marriage was abrupt and jarring. The tender suitor became the demanding husband, and the romantic language of flowers and stars dissolved into the realities of consummation. The dread of the wedding night was thus intensified by disillusionment. Women discovered that the love they had been promised was tethered to duties they had not imagined. The physical setting of the wedding night compounded the fear. Brides were led ceremonially to the chamber, their disrobing witnessed indirectly by family expectations. Corsets constrained their bodies, white gowns symbolized innocence soon to be surrendered. The bed loomed as the stage for the consummation of vows. Even privacy was scarce, as servants prepared rooms and households waited for proof of consummation. The bridal chamber, instead of sanctuary, became a theater of fear where the woman's modesty was tested, her ignorance exposed, and her obedience demanded. Pregnancy was an ever-present spectre. Without reliable contraception, marital sex almost inevitably led to childbearing. Each pregnancy carried risks of injury or death. Economic burdens multiplied with each child. For working-class women, pregnancy meant hardship. For middle-class women, it meant frailty and withdrawal. The dread of the wedding night was thus inseparable from the dread of pregnancy. Women entered marriage knowing, or quickly learning, that every sexual act carried the possibility of another ordeal, perhaps even a fatal one. What began on the wedding night continued throughout marriage. The doctrine of conjugal rights demanded constant submission. Refusal was rarely possible. Resistance could mean legal compulsion. Wives learned to endure, often retreating into invalidism, melancholy, or silence. The dread that began in the bridal chamber echoed through the years, transforming into chronic anxiety, ill health, or quiet despair. The wedding night was not the end of fear, but its beginning. The psychological consequences were profound. Women withdrew into invalidism, their bodies expressing what their voices could not. Nervous disorders, melancholy, and female complaints became widespread diagnoses, masking the realities of marital coercion. Silence itself became a survival strategy, a way to endure without open rebellion. Literature reflected this toll, with characters like Dorothea Brooke, Tess Durbeyfield, and countless unnamed fragile wives embodying the costs of a system that demanded obedience but denied agency. Yet even within this oppressive structure, resistance stirred. Frances Power Cobbe denounced wife torture, Josephine Butler fought the double standards of the Contagious Diseases Acts, and Caroline Norton campaigned for property rights. The New Woman emerged in fiction and journalism, demanding autonomy over her body and her choices. Women doctors began to reshape medical discourse, and writers exposed the limitations of marriage. These critiques did not end the dread, but they named it. They turned private suffering into public discourse and laid the foundations for reform. The cracks they made in Victorian ideology would widen in the 20th century, leading to the eventual recognition of consent, the criminalization of marital rape, and the broader liberation of women's sexuality. The dread of the Victorian wedding night was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the product of a society that constructed women as angels of purity, denied them knowledge, bound them in law, burdened them with religion, pathologized their suffering, and silenced their voices. It was rational fear in the face of systemic control. To study this dread is to glimpse the hidden underside of Victorian respectability. The grand houses, the elaborate ceremonies, the novels of romance, all are incomplete without acknowledging the private fear of countless women whose experiences were written not in public record, but in diaries, whispers, and silences. Victorian women dreaded their wedding nights because those nights symbolized the convergence of every structure that constrained them: law, medicine, religion, culture, and family. They dreaded not only the act itself, but the lifetime it represented, of pregnancies endured, of rights denied, of silence imposed. Yet from that dread also emerged the seeds of change. Reformers, writers, and activists gave voice to what had been hidden. They began the long work of dismantling the structures that had made women's fear seem natural. The dread of the Victorian wedding night remains one of the most revealing windows into 19th-century society. It reminds us that beneath the surface of respectability lay a world of fear and suffering, but also resilience, resistance, and the beginnings of transformation.